A dog sat outside a locked warehouse. For 30 days after the outbreak, it wouldn't leave. I found the dog before I found the door. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it now, months later, in whatever passes for safety these days. They expect me to say, I saw the warehouse first. The rusted corrugated walls, the chain wound 3 times through the loading bay handles, the faded stencil that once read Coastal Freight and Storage. But no. I saw the dog first, sitting so still in the amber wash of a dying street lamp that for a full 10 seconds I thought it was a statue someone had dragged out of a garden and abandoned in the ash. It was a shepherd mix, ribs visible beneath a coat the color of wet cardboard, one ear torn at the tip. It didn't flinch when I stepped over the toppled newspaper stand between us. It didn't growl. It just looked at me the way you look at someone who's interrupting something important. And then it turned its head back toward the warehouse door, like I'd already been dismissed. My name is Mara Voss. Before the world ended in the particular mundane way it ends for everyone, not all at once, but in 100 small betrayals of infrastructure and trust, I was a paramedic. I know what a body looks like when it's given up. I know what a body looks like when it's still fighting. That dog was still fighting. And it had been fighting for what I would later learn was 26 days by the time I arrived. My brother, Denny, worked loading docks for a produce distributor 2 blocks from Coastal Freight. He'd texted me the morning the National Guard cordon went up. Staying with the guys at the warehouse. It's reinforced. Don't try to come get me. I love you. Tell Mom I love her too. That was the last message. Not from him. Not from anyone at that address. For 3 weeks, I told myself cell towers were down. That silence was just silence. That the absence of bad news was its own kind of mercy. Then I ran out of the specific denial that keeps a person moving forward. And I started walking toward the address on his last text, because staying still had become worse than the alternative. I didn't expect a dog to be the first living thing I found there. Hey, I said. Low, the way you talk to something that might bolt or might bite. Hey, buddy. It didn't come to me. It didn't move at all except to blink, slow, deliberate, like it was conserving the calories that particular motion cost. There was a length of paracord looped around its neck, frayed at the end, where it had clearly chewed through whatever had once tethered it. So something had tied it here. Something had wanted it to stay, or hadn't wanted it to leave. And at some point, the difference between those 2 things had stopped mattering. I was still crouched there, maybe 8 feet away, running my thumb over the edge of a folding knife I kept in my jacket, more out of habit than confidence, when the warehouse made a sound. Not a human sound. Not quite. It was a low scrape, metal dragging against concrete from somewhere deep inside, followed by a wet, guttural exhale that carried through the loading bay's rusted seams like breath through a keyhole. The dog's head snapped toward the sound before I'd even fully processed it, ears pinned flat, and a growl built in its throat that I felt more than heard. A vibration traveling up through the cracked pavement into the soles of my boots. I'd seen infected before. Everyone had by then, whether they wanted to or not. But something about hearing one contained trapped, pacing, hungry, inches away behind sheet metal was worse than seeing one in the open. In the open you could run. Behind that door, whatever was making that sound had nowhere to go, which meant it had had 26 days to get angrier, hungrier, and more singular in its purpose than anything I'd encountered wandering loose in the streets. The dog rose onto its front paws, chest low, and let out one sharp bark that cracked across the empty lot like a gunshot. Not a warning to me, a warning at the door, at whatever was on the other side of it. I should have left right then. Every instinct built by 3 weeks of survival told me to back away slowly and find another route to wherever Denny might actually be. Instead, I stayed crouched in the settling dark, watching a starving dog defend a door that led nowhere good. And I understood, before I understood anything else about that place, that it wasn't guarding the warehouse. It was guarding something inside it. I didn't sleep that night. I found a defensible spot on the roof of a shipping container across the lot, high enough that nothing without a ladder could reach me, and I watched the dog through the scope of a rifle I'd taken off a National Guardsman who no longer needed it. It never lay down fully. It curled, occasionally, nose tucked beneath its tail in the posture of an animal trying to trap its own warmth. But every 20 minutes or so, its head would lift, ears rotating like small satellite dishes, tracking sounds I couldn't hear from that distance. Twice more that night, the warehouse groaned with that same wet scraping. And twice more, the dog rose to its feet and postured toward the door, hackles up, teeth bared at nothing visible. By morning, I had company. "You'll want to come down from there before the light gets good," a voice called up, gravelly, unhurried. The voice of a man who had stopped being afraid of consequences a long time ago. Snipers work both directions in daylight. I looked down to find an older man standing near the container's base, maybe 60, wearing a canvas coat too heavy for the season and a knit cap pulled low over gray-streaked hair. He held a crowbar loosely in one hand, not raised, not threatening, just present, the way a person holds a tool they've stopped noticing they're carrying. "Silas Okafor," he said when I climbed down, close enough now to see the deep creases fanning from his eyes. "I worked the docks here for 11 years before the world decided docks weren't worth having anymore. Mara, you're not the first to sit up there and watch the dog." He nodded toward the animal, which had turned its attention to us with the flat, assessing stare of something that had learned to catalog threats by habit rather than fear. "I've been coming by every few days since it started, bringing what I can spare. It won't take food from my hand. Won't take it unless I set it down and walk off first." "How long has it been out here?" 26 days when I first noticed it. Add your night to that, and we're at 28 now." He said this with the specific weariness of a man who had done the arithmetic too many times already. There were people barricaded inside when the quarantine broke down. Warehouse workers, mostly. A few families who ran in off the street looking for shelter because it looked solid and it had a working generator. I heard the last radio call myself, on a scanner I kept from before. Somebody inside saying they'd sealed the loading doors from the inside, chained them, and they were going to wait it out. My chest went tight. Wait it out from what? Silas's eyes flicked toward the warehouse, then back to me. And something in his expression told me he already understood more than he wanted to say aloud. From whatever got in with them before they finished sealing the doors. The dog, as if summoned by the subject of itself, trotted a slow perimeter of the loading bay, nose low, tracing some invisible boundary it had memorized through repetition. It paused at a specific point along the wall, not the main doors, but a smaller side hatch half obscured by a collapsed pallet stack, and sat again, facing that hatch instead of the main entrance, its posture identical to the one I'd seen it hold all night at the front. "There's more than one point of entry," I said. "There's more than one point it's decided needs guarding," Silas corrected. "That's not the same thing. A door is a door. That dog's not guarding architecture. It's guarding people, or what's left being people. And it's been doing it long enough that I don't think it's confused about the difference between the two anymore." I thought about Denny's text, staying with the guys at the warehouse. It's reinforced. "I need to get inside," I said. Silas studied me for a long moment, the crowbar still loose in his grip. And something behind his eyes shifted from caution into something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of one grieving person identifying another. Then you'd better hope whatever's in there recognizes the difference too. Because that dog's not going to let just anyone through. It's had 4 weeks to decide who the door belongs to. Behind him, without warning, the loading bay doors shuddered on their chains, and both of us went still. The shudder came again, harder, metal groaning against metal, and the dog was on its feet instantly, body angled between us and the door, a low, continuous growl rolling out of it, like something mechanical rather than living. "Get behind the container," Silas said, already moving. No panic in his voice. Just the calm efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion in his head 100 times without ever wanting to perform it. I followed, and we crouched together in the container's shadow as the chains rattled a 3rd time, then went still. Nothing came through. The doors held. Whatever was testing them from the inside either lacked the strength or the coordination to force them open. And after a minute, the sound settled back into the low, patient scraping I'd heard through the night, the sound of something pacing an enclosed space, waiting. "That's new," Silas muttered. "Usually it's just the one noise. That was 3 back to back. Something's changed in there. Or something's getting stronger." He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. We spent the rest of the morning at a careful distance, and Silas filled in details the way people do when grief has made them need to talk, even when talking doesn't help. The warehouse had sheltered maybe 15 people in the outbreak's first chaotic hours, dock workers. 2 families, a delivery driver who'd been unlucky enough to be making a drop when the quarantine lines collapsed. Someone inside had gotten on a CB radio during the 2nd night, giving a partial head count, saying they'd walled off a section using shipping containers, that they had food and water for weeks, that they'd be fine if everyone just held their ground and waited for evac that never came. Then the transmission stopped. Not abruptly. Silas described it as a slow attrition. Fewer voices each night, until there was only static. And eventually, nothing at all, except whatever the dog had appointed itself to guard. "You said the last radio call mentioned something got in with them," I said. "Before they sealed it. A bite. That's what the second to last call said. Somebody got bit helping a family through the side hatch, and they didn't tell the group right away because they were scared of being put out. By the time anyone realized, the doors were already chained from the inside." Silas rubbed a thumb along the crowbar's handle, an old nervous habit worn smooth into the metal. "You want my honest opinion? That's not 15 people trapped in there anymore. That's whatever 15 people become after 4 weeks in a sealed room with something that started as one of them." I made myself ask the question I'd been avoiding since the text message. "Would you know the name Denny Voss? Worked the produce dock 2 streets over." Something crossed Silas's face, not recognition exactly, but the particular flicker of a man deciding how much comfort a lie is worth against how much damage a truth might do. Can't say I do. Doesn't mean he wasn't in there. I only knew the coastal freight crew by face, mostly, not by name. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it wasn't a door slammed shut either. And in the arithmetic of the world we now lived in, an open door, even an uncertain one, counted as hope. The dog, having decided the immediate threat had passed, returned to its position at the main entrance, folding itself down with the specific economy of an animal that had learned to ration its own energy like a currency. I watched it settle, watched its eyes track the 2 of us with the wary neutrality of a sentry evaluating whether we belonged to the category of threat or the category of things to be tolerated. "There's a name scratched into the door," Silas said suddenly, standing, moving closer to the entrance than either of us had yet dared. He crouched at the base of the loading bay, fingers tracing something at eye level with the crouching dog. Been there since I first started coming. Never asked myself why until now. I crossed the lot to see it myself. Careful, slow, the dog's eyes on me the entire way. And when I got close enough to read the crude, gouged letters scratched into the rusted metal at exactly the height a man would reach if he were pressed against the inside of the door, my knees nearly went out from under me. D. Voss, still alive, don't open. I stood there long enough that Silas had to say my name twice before I heard him. Don't open. 3 words scratched by my brother's hand. I recognized the particular slant of his D's, the way he always closed his letters too tight. A habit from years of filling out shipping manifests on cheap clipboards, and beneath them, an instruction that contradicted the entire reason I had walked 7 miles through infected territory to find him. He was alive. He had told me not to come. Mara. Silas's hand found my shoulder, steadying, not gripping. We need to move off the door. The dog's getting agitated. It was true. The animal had risen again, body rigid, attention split between the two of us and the scratched message, as though it understood impossibly, or maybe not impossibly at all, after 4 weeks of vigil, exactly what those words meant, and exactly how dangerous it was for strangers to linger near them. We retreated to the shipping container, and I sat with my back against corrugated steel and let myself shake for exactly as long as I decided I could afford to, which in that world was never very long. He's alive, I said finally. 28 days in there and he's alive. He was alive when he scratched that, Silas said, careful with his tenses in a way that told me he'd learned the hard way not to promise anyone certainty. Doesn't tell us about now. Before I could answer, a new voice cut across the lot, sharp, clipped. The voice of someone used to being obeyed, without argument. You two are sitting in my scavenging radius. A woman rounded the corner of a burned-out delivery truck flanked by 2 others. One of them a lean man with a tactical vest stitched together from mismatched gear. The other a teenage girl who hung slightly back, eyes darting more toward the dog than toward us. The woman herself carried a machete low against her thigh, blade dulled with use, movements economical and unwasted. Renata Cole. This warehouse has been on my list for 2 weeks. I'd appreciate it if whatever you're doing didn't attract more of them to my supply run. We're not here for supplies, I said. Everyone's here for supplies. That's the only reason anyone goes anywhere anymore. Renata's eyes moved to the dog, assessing it the way she'd assess a lock or a length of chain, an obstacle with a solution. That thing's been sitting on the one entry point I actually want into this building for a month. I've watched 3 of my people try to move past it. It doesn't bite, but it doesn't budge either. And eventually you get tired of stepping around a dog that won't cooperate. The teenage girl behind her, 14, maybe 15, with a scarf wound high around her neck and the specific stillness of someone who had learned that stillness kept you alive, took a small step forward, toward the animal, before Renata's arm shot out to stop her. Petra, not yet. It's not aggressive, Petra said, quiet, insistent in the particular way of teenagers who have decided something is true and intend to prove it regardless of what adults believe. It's just tired. Look at it. I did look. The dog had gone still again, watching this new configuration of humans with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. 4 weeks of vigilance had worn something down in it that food alone wouldn't restore. There's a name scratched on that door, Silas said, standing, addressing Renata directly with the flat authority of a man who'd worked docks long enough to recognize when a conversation needed redirecting. Her brother's name. He wrote, "Don't open," underneath it. "Whatever you're planning to loot in there, you should know it's not empty. And it's not just infected either. Could be survivors. Could be worse than either." Renata's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes recalculated. How long ago was that written? No way to know, I admitted. The dog's been here 28 days. Could have been day 1. Could have been yesterday. Then we have a decision to make, and not a lot of daylight to make it in. Renata looked between Silas and me, then at the warehouse itself, sizing it the way a person sizes a debt they're deciding whether to collect. I don't leave supply behind because of a message that could be a month old. But I also don't walk my people through a door with an unknown survivor count and an unknown infected count without more information than a dog's mood and some scratched graffiti. "So, what do you want?" I asked. "Time," Renata said. "And someone who actually wants to go through that door for reasons that aren't mine. Because that means you'll be more careful going in than I would be." Her eyes settled on me with an appraisal that felt less like calculation now and more like recognition. "You want your brother? Fine. That's useful to me. It means you won't be reckless. And it means when we do go in, you'll have a reason to lead." Petra had drifted closer to the dog while the adults talked. Close enough now that the animal lifted its head to track her without rising, without growling, an ambiguous tolerance that none of us fully understood yet. "He's not aggressive," she said again, softer this time, almost to herself. "He's just been alone too long." None of us disagreed with her, though I suspect each of us, in that moment, was thinking about a different kind of alone. We made camp that evening in the shell of a small dockmaster's office, 200 yards from the warehouse. Close enough to keep watch. Far enough that the sound of 6 people breathing wouldn't carry to whatever paced behind those chained doors. Renata's group had food, real food, not the desperate improvisation I'd been living on. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I ate something that hadn't come out of a can with the label torn off. It was Petra who told me the fuller version of what had happened at Coastal Freight, pieced together from things she'd overheard on scavenging runs and things Renata's second, the tactical vest man, whose name turned out to be Correa, had confirmed independently. "There was a shift change happening when the quarantine broke," she said, sitting close enough to the fire that its light caught the exhaustion in her face, older than her years should have allowed. Some workers were already inside doing inventory. Others ran in from the street because the building had steel doors, and everyone figured steel doors meant safe. Correa talked to a guy 2 weeks ago, before he... She paused, recalibrated. Before he wasn't around anymore. That guy said his cousin was in there. Said the group inside had a working radio for the first few days, coordinating with other shelter points, until the transmissions from Coastal Freight started sounding wrong. Wrong how? Fewer voices each call, and then one call where somebody said they'd had to move the food stores because he keeps finding them, and nobody ever explained who he was. Petra hugged her knees. That's the part that scared everyone off, not the infected outside, whatever was already inside with them. I thought of Denny's message. Staying with the guys at the warehouse. It's reinforced. He'd sent that before any of this. Before the doors were chained. Before whatever had gotten in during that shift change chaos had time to become the thing Petra was describing secondhand. Filtered through fear and rumor and a month of silence. I wanted to believe the "don't open" scratched into the door was a warning meant to protect me from infected, nothing more sinister than that. But warnings written in that particular hurried, gouging hand, the hand of someone pressed against a door with limited time, rarely came from simple caution. They came from someone who had seen exactly what waited on the other side and had decided the not knowing was safer for the people they loved. "Your brother," Renata said, appearing at the edge of the firelight with the specific quiet of someone who'd been listening longer than she'd let on. "What kind of man is he? Careful? Reckless? The kind who'd survive a month locked in with something that eats the food faster than he can hide it?" "He's careful," I said, and heard the defensiveness in my own voice before I could soften it. "He's the one who used to tell me to check my mirrors twice before backing out of a driveway. He's not reckless. If he's alive in there, it's because he made himself small and quiet and useful enough that whatever's happening around him didn't think he was worth the trouble. That's not a survival strategy," Silas said it gently, from where he sat cleaning the crowbar's handle with an oiled rag out of pure habit. "That's a stalling tactic. Eventually you run out of small and quiet." Nobody had an answer for that, and the fire popped and settled into the kind of silence that people who've lost things learn to sit inside without flinching. Later, when the others had drifted toward whatever sleep the night would allow them, I walked the perimeter alone and found the dog exactly where it always was, curled at the base of the main doors, eyes tracking my approach without alarm. "Did he feed you?" I asked it, crouching at a respectful distance. "Is that why you won't leave? Because someone in there's been slipping food through a gap somewhere, and you're the only proof he's still trying?" The dog didn't answer, obviously, but it did something it hadn't done for me before it stood, crossed the distance between us at an unhurried pace, and pressed its head briefly against my knee before returning to its post, as if it had decided, in whatever calculus governs a starving animal's trust, that I had earned something small. I didn't sleep well after that, not from fear, from the specific, aching hope that a dog's small gesture had somehow confirmed something I had no right to believe yet, that Denny was not just alive 28 days ago, but alive enough, still, to be feeding the only witness left to his survival. The attack came at 3 a.m., and it came from the direction none of us had been watching. I woke to Correa's voice, low and urgent, calling names into the dark. And by the time I'd grabbed my rifle and rolled out of the dockmaster office's doorway, the source of the alarm was already visible against the moonlit lot, a cluster of shapes moving with the particular stumbling asymmetry that meant infected, 6 or 7 of them, drawn by scent or sound or simple bad luck toward the very perimeter we'd assumed was secure. "Container now," Renata barked, and we moved as a unit toward the shipping container I'd slept atop my first night, boosting Petra up first, then the others, weapons up and covering the retreat in the loose, practiced choreography of people who had done this dance before and hated every repetition of it. The infected closed faster than I expected. 4 weeks into any outbreak, you learn the myths people told in the first days, that they're slow, that they're clumsy, that a healthy adult can always outrun one, are only true of the newly turned. These had been shambling this district for a month, hunting, adapting in whatever crude way the infection allowed. And the two in front moved with an economy of motion that made my stomach drop. Silas went down first, not bitten, just knocked from his footing by a shoulder check from something that used to be a person twice his size. I fired before I'd consciously decided to, the shot cracking across the lot, dropping the nearest one in a spray that even the darkness couldn't fully soften. And Correa was there a half-second later, hauling Silas upright by the collar of his heavy coat. That was when the dog moved. It came from the warehouse's doorway at a dead run, a streak of matted fur and bared teeth, and it hit the legs of the second infected with a force that shouldn't have been possible from an animal that had spent 4 weeks starving on borrowed scraps. The thing went down hard, and the dog was already retreating before it could grab hold, darting in again at a different angle, snapping, drawing its attention, its aggression, its focus away from us and onto itself. "It's giving us an opening," Petra shouted from the container's edge, and she was right. The dog's frantic, darting harassment had scattered the loose formation of infected, just enough that Correa and I could drop 2 more with clean shots, while Renata dragged Silas the rest of the way to cover. It ended in under 2 minutes, the way these things always seem to. An eternity compressed into almost nothing. 6 bodies on the ground that had once been people, and a silence afterward that felt louder than the gunfire had. The dog didn't return to us for congratulation or comfort. It limped, favoring its back left leg, a shallow gash visible along its flank in the moonlight, directly back to the warehouse doors, and lay down in its usual spot, breathing hard, watching the lot with the same vigilance it always held, as though the fight had been an interruption to its actual job rather than the job itself. Renata was the one who went to it first. Not Petra, who wanted to, but Renata, crouching a few feet away with her hands visible and open, studying the wound along its flank with the assessing calm of someone recalculating a cost-benefit ledger in real time. "It just saved 4 of our lives," she said, to no one in particular, to all of us. "An animal that's been starving for a month, guarding a door it has every reason to have abandoned weeks ago. And it chose to spend the last of its strength keeping strangers alive." "So?" Correa asked, still breathing hard, still scanning the tree line beyond the lot for more movement. "So I don't think we're dealing with a stray anymore," Renata said. "I think we're dealing with something that understands loyalty better than half the people I've traveled with since this started." She looked up, found my eyes across the lot. "And I think whatever's worth that kind of loyalty behind that door might be worth more than whatever supplies I came here for." Behind her, the dog let out a long, shuddering exhale and closed its eyes, not in surrender, but in the particular rest of something that had, for one night at least, done enough. By morning, the argument had already started. And it started with the thing none of us wanted to say directly. Someone was going to have to open that door. And none of us agreed on when, or how, or what we were prepared to do with whatever came out. "We wait," Silas said, jaw tight, favoring the shoulder he'd wrenched in the fall the night before. "We wait until we know more. That message on the door is a month old at least. We have no idea what's behind it now." "We don't have the luxury of waiting," Renata countered, pacing a tight line near the fire's ashes. "That attack last night wasn't random. Something's pushing infected traffic through this district, and every day we sit here is another day we're exposed in the open instead of behind 4 walls and a roof, which, need I remind everyone, is exactly what that warehouse offers if we clear it properly." "If," I said, "if we clear it, you're talking about opening a door on an unknown number of infected in an enclosed space with limited visibility and no idea what condition the survivors are in, if there are any left to find. I'm talking about a decision that has to be made either way, Mara. And I'd rather make it on our terms, in daylight, with a plan, than have it made for us in the dark the way it nearly was last night." Petra, who had been unusually quiet through the exchange, sat near the dog which had allowed her closer than any of us the previous night. Some fragile trust built in the adrenaline aftermath of shared danger, and finally spoke without looking up from where her hand rested lightly against its uninjured side. "What if we're not the ones who decide?" she said. "What if we let him decide?" "Let a dog make a tactical call," Correa said, not unkindly, more tired than dismissive. "He's been making tactical calls for a month," Petra said. "He decided which door to guard. He decided when to fight and when to hold position. He decided, last night, exactly when the risk was worth taking. I don't think that's an accident. I think he's been reading something we can't this whole time, and I think if we watch him closely enough before we do anything permanent, he'll tell us when it's actually safe. It was, I would later think, the single most useful thing anyone said in that camp. And it came from the person the rest of us had been least inclined to treat as an authority. We spent the day observing instead of acting, a discipline that cost us nothing and taught us everything. The dog's behavior split cleanly along a pattern once we started paying attention. Calm, resting posture during the mid-morning and early afternoon hours, and a rigid, alert vigilance that intensified sharply from dusk into the deepest part of the night. Silas theorized the infected inside, however many remained, however changed, followed some circadian rhythm degraded from their human origin, more active in darkness, quieter, weaker, perhaps even resting during full daylight. If that holds, Renata said, studying the pattern Silas had sketched crudely on the back of a torn cardboard flap, then daylight's our window, not night. We open that door at midday, when whatever's inside is at its slowest, and we have hours of visibility to work with instead of minutes. And if we're wrong about the pattern, I asked, then we're wrong at noon instead of at 3 a.m., which gives us marginally better odds of surviving being wrong. Renata's tone left no room for false comfort, which I had by then come to appreciate about her more than I resented. The plan solidified through the afternoon. Correa and Renata would breach the main loading doors using tools Silas had scavenged from a nearby machine shop, while I would take the smaller side hatch, the one the dog had originally sat facing during my first hours in that lot, on the theory that whatever inhabited that specific entry point was more likely to include actual survivors than infected, given the dog's apparent distinction between the two access points. Petra would stay back with the dog, out of the breach zone entirely, a decision she fought and eventually lost, though not without extracting a promise from Renata that she'd be allowed forward the moment the site was declared clear. As dusk approached and the dog's posture shifted, right on schedule, into its nightly vigilance, I found myself standing at a distance from the warehouse doors, watching the animal that had, in less than 48 hours, become the closest thing our fractured, temporary alliance had to a compass. Tomorrow, I told it, quiet enough that only it could hear. Tomorrow, we find out what you've been protecting. It didn't look at me. Its eyes stayed fixed on the door, unblinking, as though it already understood, in whatever way an animal understands anything, that the vigil it had maintained for 29 days was about to end one way or another. Petra found the bandana at dawn, and everything that had felt merely urgent the night before became, in the space of a single discovery, unbearably personal. She'd been sitting with the dog while the rest of us finalized the breach plan, running her fingers absently through the fur along its uninjured flank, when her hand caught on something half buried in the matted coat near its collar. A strip of faded blue fabric, tied loosely, the kind of thing a man might use to wipe sweat or wrap around a cut wrist in a pinch. She pulled it free and turned it over. And there, stitched crudely along one edge in thread that had clearly been added after the fabric's original manufacture, were 3 letters, D.V. She brought it to me without a word, understanding immediately what she'd found, and I took it from her hands with a care that had nothing to do with the fabric's fragility and everything to do with what it meant. Denny had made this. I remembered it a strip cut from an old work shirt, embroidered clumsily one bored winter when our mother had taught us both basic stitching, and he'd decided, at 19, that monogramming his gear was the height of practicality. He'd worn it on his wrist for years, a habit our mother found endearing, and I found mildly ridiculous. And now it was here, tied loosely enough around a starving dog's neck that it must have been secured deliberately, by someone who wanted this specific animal marked as belonging to him. "He tied this on," I said, voice unsteady in a way I hadn't allowed myself in front of these near strangers before. "He gave the dog something of his. That's not an accident. That's him trying to send a message the only way he had left. Or trying to make sure whoever found the dog knew who to look for," Silas said, gentler than I'd yet heard him. "Same message, either way it's read. He wanted this animal connected to him. He wanted it found." Renata studied the bandana without touching it. Her expression, unreadable in the way I'd learned, meant she was recalculating something important. "That changes the breach order," she said finally. "If your brother's alive and coherent enough to tie a message onto a dog a month ago, there's a real chance he's still coherent now, still functional, still capable of helping us clear whatever's in there instead of being one more thing we have to clear around." She looked at me directly. "You go through the side hatch first, not last. If he's near that entry point, which the dog's positioning suggests he might be, you want to be the first face he sees, not the last, in case seeing a stranger first is the difference between him helping us and him panicking in a space where panic gets people killed." It was a reasonable, tactical argument, and it also happened to give me exactly what I wanted, which made me distrust my own gratitude, even as I felt it. "What if it's not him?" Correa said quietly. The first thing he'd contributed to the conversation all morning. "What if the dog's still guarding him because that's the last place it remembers him being? And the man himself is long gone. And what's on the other side of that hatch is something wearing what's left of him?" Nobody answered that directly, because none of us had an answer that wouldn't have sounded like false comfort. And false comfort had become a luxury none of us could afford to offer each other anymore. I spent the remaining hours before noon checking my gear with the specific, repetitive thoroughness of someone trying to occupy their hands, so their mind wouldn't wander somewhere it couldn't safely return from. Rifle, sidearm, the folding knife I'd carried since the first week, a headlamp scavenged from a hardware store 2 towns back. Petra sat near me for a while, not speaking, simply present. And at one point, she reached over and retied the faded blue bandana, Denny's bandana, around my own wrist without asking permission. A small, wordless gesture I understood completely, and didn't have the composure to thank her for properly. The dog watched all of this preparation with an intensity that had sharpened since the discovery of the bandana. As though it too understood that the day's activity marked the end of something it had been holding together through sheer, stubborn will for 29 days. And it did not know yet whether that ending would be the one it had been waiting for. By the time Renata called us together for final positions, the sun stood almost directly overhead, and the warehouse cast almost no shadow at all. A strange, exposed clarity for a moment that felt, in every other sense, like the darkest one we'd faced yet. The disagreement that nearly broke us apart happened in the final 10 minutes before the breach. And it happened because Renata, in the specific way of someone used to command and unused to being questioned in front of an audience, decided to change the plan without consulting anyone she'd have needed to consult. "We're going through the main doors first," she announced, tools already in hand, Correa positioning himself at the chain without waiting for confirmation. "Side hatch stays sealed until we've assessed the main floor." "That's not the plan we agreed on," I said, feeling the ground shift under something I'd allowed myself to hope was settled. "The side hatch first, because that's where the dog's attention has been concentrated. Because that's likely where Denny is." "The plan changed because I changed it," Renata said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of someone who had never really considered the earlier arrangement binding. "I looked at that side hatch again this morning. It's narrow, it's got limited sight lines, and if there's a concentration of infected pressed against it from the inside, which is exactly what a dog guarding a specific point for a month would suggest. Then sending one person through it alone is sending one person to die. For information, we can get more safely through the main entrance, with 3 of us covering each other. You're choosing supply logistics over my brother's life. I'm choosing the option that gets the most people out of this alive, including you, including him if he's in there. Renata didn't raise her voice, which somehow made the disagreement feel sharper, more final than shouting would have. I understand what he means to you. I don't understand why that means I should send you through a choke point alone instead of through a wider entry with support. Silas stepped between us. Physically, the crowbar he'd carried the entire time, now held with the specific purpose of a man about to use it as a lever rather than a weapon. She's not wrong tactically, he said to me, quiet, apologetic in tone if not in substance. I know that's not what you want to hear right now. He's alive back there, I said, and heard my own voice crack in a way that embarrassed me even as I couldn't stop it. He wrote "Don't open" because he was trying to protect someone. And if we go through the main doors first and disturb whatever's settled in there, we might trigger exactly the thing he was warning us about before I even get the chance to reach him. Petra, standing near the dog at the perimeter Renata had set for her, spoke up then with a steadiness that startled all of us into silence. "Watch him," she said, pointing. "Just watch him for 1 more minute before anyone decides anything." The dog had risen to its feet the moment the argument started escalating, and it was doing something none of us had seen it do before, pacing, agitated, moving in tight circuits between the main doors and the side hatch, glancing back at each of us in turn as though trying, in whatever limited vocabulary an animal has, for urgency, to communicate a preference it had no other way to express. Then it stopped at the side hatch, sat, and did not move again. Eyes fixed on Renata with an intensity that felt, absurdly, like a direct address. Renata exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders shifting from confrontation into something more like grudging reconsideration. "Fine," she said. "Side hatch first. But Correa comes with you. And I want 30 seconds of silence before either of you touches that latch, so we can listen for movement inside before we commit to an entry point we can't easily retreat from." It wasn't a full surrender, and I understood even then that Renata had allowed herself to be persuaded by the dog's behavior rather than by my argument, which stung in a way I chose not to examine too closely given everything else demanding my attention. We took our positions in the noon light, the warehouse silent except for the faint, familiar scrape of movement somewhere deep inside its walls. And as Correa set his hand against the side hatch's rusted latch, the dog rose one final time, pressed itself against my leg with its full weight, and let out a sound I hadn't heard from it before, not as a growl, not a bark, but something closer to a low, mourning whine, as if it already knew, in whatever way animals know things humans spend their whole lives refusing to accept, exactly what we were about to find. The latch gave way with a shriek of corroded metal, and for 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all. Then the smell hit a wall of it, thick and organic and wrong, in a way that no amount of preparation ever fully readies a person for. And behind me, I heard Correa gag once, quietly, before forcing his breathing back under control. I pushed the hatch the rest of the way open with the barrel of my rifle rather than my hand. And the dim interior beyond resolved itself, slowly, into shapes my headlamp carved out of the dark. The space just inside the hatch had been converted, deliberately, into something like a barricaded room within the larger warehouse pallets, stacked into makeshift walls, a section of chain-link fencing repurposed as a partial door, the unmistakable architecture of people who had understood, early, that survival meant subdividing a large space into smaller, defensible ones. Bedding lay scattered across the concrete floor, some of it stained in ways I made myself not look at too closely. And empty ration containers had been organized into a neat pile against one wall with the specific, meaningless order of people trying to maintain some illusion of normalcy long after normalcy had become impossible. "Clear," Correa whispered, sweeping his light across the immediate space, though the word felt more like hope than assessment, given how much darkness still stretched beyond our narrow beams. Then a voice came from somewhere behind the pallet wall, hoarse, cracked from disuse, but unmistakably, achingly familiar. "Mara?" I don't remember crossing the distance between the hatch and the sound of that voice. I remember the pallet wall's rough edge biting into my palm as I pulled myself around it. And I remember the shape that resolved in my headlamp's beam, a man, thinner than I'd ever seen him, beard grown ragged and uneven, eyes sunken but alert in a way that told me, before he'd said another word, that whatever had happened in this building over the past month had cost him something he would never fully get back. Denny. His name came out of me as something between a sob and a command. And then I was on my knees in front of him, hands gripping his shoulders, checking without conscious decision for wounds, for bites, for the specific catalog of injury that determined, in this world, whether reunion was a mercy or a delayed grief. "You shouldn't be here," he said. And even in his exhaustion, even in whatever relief flickered behind his eyes at seeing me, there was an undertone of genuine alarm that cut through the joy of the moment like a blade. "The message, did you see the message? I told you not to." "I saw it. I came anyway." "You're not surprised by that, are you?" A ghost of the old, exasperated affection crossed his face, quickly replaced by something more urgent. "There are others," he said, voice dropping even lower, glancing past me toward Correa, toward the darkness beyond our small pocket of light. "Not many. 4 of us left in this section. We sealed ourselves off from the rest of the floor 12 days ago." "Sealed off from what?" Correa asked, moving to cover the gap in the chain-link barrier while Denny spoke. Denny's eyes found mine, and I watched him decide, in real time, how much truth I could bear hearing all at once. "There's a man," he said finally. "Was a man. Marcus Felt, one of the shift supervisors. He got bit early, during the chaos when everyone was running in off the street. And he didn't tell anyone because he was scared we'd put him out. By the time the fever hit him, we were already sealed in from the outside, chains on every door, and there was nowhere to put him, even if we'd wanted to. He turned inside a locked building with 15 people, I said, understanding arriving in pieces I didn't want assembled. He turned and then he kept turning, Denny said, and something in his voice cracked open, exhausted, horrified, even after a month of living beside the fact of it. "It's not like the ones outside. He's been in here longer than any infected usually survives a month. More, and he's not slow anymore, not confused. He's learned this building. He knows where we hide supplies. He knows the sound of every door in this place. And he's smart enough now to wait outside the ones he can't force open, patient, for hours, days, until whoever's inside makes a mistake." "That's not possible," Correa said, quiet, more to himself than to either of us. "They don't get smarter. They get worse, but not smarter." "Tell that to the 6 people who aren't with us anymore," Denny said, and the flatness in his voice, the specific exhaustion of a man who had stopped being surprised by horror weeks ago, told me everything about what those 6 absences had cost him. I don't know what's different about him. Maybe it's how long he's been left to develop without any outside interference. Maybe it's something about how he turned, gradual instead of sudden. that let something survive in there that shouldn't have. I don't have an explanation. I only have 4 weeks of watching him get worse. And a dog outside that I fed through a gap in the wall every night I could reach it, because he was the only chance anyone had of you knowing I was still here. Behind us, faint but unmistakable, the low scraping we'd heard from outside resolved suddenly into something closer, something with purpose, moving through the warehouse's dark toward the sound of voices it had, apparently, been waiting a very long time to hear again. "He's coming," Denny said. And the flat certainty in his voice, no panic, just grim recognition, told me this was a rhythm he'd learned to read the way sailors read weather. "How many others are with you?" Correa asked, already repositioning toward the hatch, weighing exit routes with the specific calculus of someone who'd survived this long by never trusting a single path. "2, in the back section. An older woman, Ilsa, and a kid, maybe 19, name's Toby. They're weak, we've been rationing hard. And Ilsa's got an infection in her leg from a fall 3 weeks back that we can't do anything about with what we've got." Denny was already moving, gathering a small satchel of belongings with the economy of someone who had rehearsed evacuation in his mind 100 times without ever having anywhere safe to evacuate to. Marcus doesn't come fast. Never has. But he doesn't stop either. And he's learned every choke point in this section. If we're going out the side hatch, we go now, while he's still on the far side of the pallet wall. I called back through the hatch to Renata and Silas, relaying what we'd found in words clipped by adrenaline. And within minutes, the retrieval became a coordinated scramble, Correa and I moving deeper into the barricaded section to help Ilsa, whose leg had swollen to something I recognized, with sick paramedic clarity, as sepsis creeping toward its final stages. While Denny guided Toby toward the hatch with the careful patience of someone who had spent a month keeping this particular person alive, against long odds. The scraping grew louder, closer, and beneath it now, unmistakably, footsteps deliberate, unhurried. The gait of something that had stopped needing to rush because it had learned, through weeks of repetition, that the people it hunted always eventually ran out of places to go. "We're not going to make it with her moving this slow," Correa said low, as Ilsa's weight sagged against him, her breathing shallow, fever-bright eyes struggling to track the urgency around her. "We make it," Denny said, sharp, final, in a voice I recognized from childhood, the voice he used when our mother was sick. And he'd decided, at 17, that despair simply wasn't an option available to him. We've made it this far. We make it the rest of the way. The footsteps stopped just beyond the pallet wall, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard breathing, wet, labored but rhythmic, patient on the other side of a barrier that had, until that moment, felt sturdy enough to trust. Then the wall shuddered once, from an impact that sent a pallet crashing sideways into the space where Toby had been standing seconds before, and through the gap it created, in the wavering light of my headlamp, I saw him. Marcus Felt had been a man once, and something of that man remained visible in the ruined architecture of his face, the shape of a jaw, the ghost of features that might once have smiled at coworkers over a morning coffee. But his eyes, when they found mine across that shattered gap, held none of the vacant, mindless hunger I'd learned to expect from a month of encounters in the streets outside. They held something closer to focus, something closer, unbearably, to recognition. He looked at Denny, and something in his ruined throat produced a sound that was almost, obscenely, almost a word. "Go," Denny said, shoving Toby toward the hatch with both hands, positioning himself between the widening gap and the rest of us, with a finality that made my stomach drop before I'd even fully processed what he was doing. "Get Ilsa through. I'll hold the gap." "Denny, no," I've had 4 weeks to learn exactly how fast he moves and exactly how much space he needs to get through a gap this size, Denny said, not looking at me, eyes fixed on the widening breach and the thing pressing through it. I can slow him down long enough for you to get everyone out. I cannot outrun him carrying anyone. There isn't a version of this where all of us make it. If I try to be a hero about carrying weight, I don't have the strength for anymore. Then we don't leave you. You leave me exactly long enough to get them through that hatch, he said. And for the first time in the exchange, his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal how much the calm had cost him to maintain. And then you come back for me, and I will be exactly as alive as I am right now. Because I intend to make this bastard work harder for it than he's had to work for anything in a month. I had exactly 1 second to decide whether I believed him. And in that second, with Ilsa's full weight sagging against Correa and Toby already half through the hatch, and Marcus Felt's ruined hand closing around the edge of a pallet with a strength that no month-old body should have retained, I made the choice that would define everything that came after. I trusted my brother's plan, and I moved. The next 90 seconds compressed into the kind of fragmented, adrenaline-blurred memory that I've spent months since trying to reassemble into something coherent. And I'm still not certain I've succeeded. I remember pushing Ilsa the rest of the way through the hatch, her weight nearly buckling my knees, Correa's hand steadying both of us from the other side. I remember Toby's face, pale and shaking, already through, already reaching back for the next person, even in his own exhaustion. I remember the sound behind me, wood splintering, metal scraping, Denny's voice raised in something between a shout and a war cry that didn't sound like fear so much as furious, deliberate defiance. And I remember the specific agony of choosing, in that moment, whether to go back for him or trust that he'd meant exactly what he said. I went back. I don't regret it, even now. Even knowing what it cost, I found him wedged against the collapsed section of the pallet wall, using a length of rebar he must have kept hidden for exactly this purpose. Holding the gap against Marcus Felt's relentless, patient pressing, with a desperation that had nothing left of finesse and everything of raw survival instinct. Blood ran from a shallow gash along his forearm, not a bite, I would learn later. Just a graze from the rebar's jagged edge. And his face had gone the particular gray of someone operating entirely on adrenaline, with nothing left in reserve behind it. "I told you to go," he gasped, not looking away from the gap, even as I raised my rifle. "I don't listen to you. Never have." I fired twice into the widening breach, and the shots connected with something that made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Not quite human. Not quite anything else either. A wet, final exhalation that suggested, at last, an ending to whatever had sustained Marcus Felt through 4 impossible weeks of patient, learned hunting. He didn't go down immediately. Whatever had kept him functional this long kept him upright for one more terrible moment. One more lurch forward against the gap. Close enough that I saw, with a clarity I wish I could unsee, the flicker of something almost like relief cross what remained of his ruined face, before the second shot finished what the first had started. And he collapsed backward into the dark beyond the pallet wall. Still, finally, completely. The silence afterward felt like its own kind of violence. Denny slid down the wall he'd been bracing, rebar clattering from fingers that had lost the strength to hold it a second longer than necessary. And I got my arms under him before he hit the ground fully. Both of us breathing in the ragged, uneven rhythm of people who had just survived something they'd have no adequate way of explaining to anyone who hadn't been standing exactly where we'd been standing. "You should have gone," he said again, quieter this time, no argument left in it, just exhaustion. "I know." I would have held. I told you I would have held. I know that too. I pressed my forehead against the top of his head, the way I used to when we were kids, and one of us had scraped a knee too badly for words to fix. Doesn't mean I was ever going to leave you to find out if you were right. We got him through the hatch minutes later. Correa and Silas pulling us both the last few feet into daylight, with the specific relief of people who'd been counting seconds against a silence they'd feared meant the worst. The reunion that followed was smaller and quieter than I'd imagined it in 3 weeks, of hoping no triumphant embrace, just exhausted bodies collapsing into whatever patch of ground would hold them. Ilsa immediately swarmed by Renata and Petra's makeshift first aid. Toby staring at open sky with the shell-shocked wonder of someone who hadn't expected to see it again. And the dog, Denny's dog, I understood now, in every sense that mattered, crossed the lot at a limping run and pressed itself against my brother's chest with a force that nearly knocked him backward, and stayed there, trembling, while Denny's hands found its matted fur and held on like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had spent a month trying to prove otherwise. We didn't stay at Coastal Freight long after that. Renata's original calculation that the warehouse offered shelter worth claiming dissolved the moment we understood what 4 weeks of patient learning infection had done to a single contained space. And none of us had the appetite to test whether Marcus felt had been an aberration or a preview of something the outbreak was quietly, terribly becoming everywhere. Ilsa didn't survive the infection in her leg. We tried. In the 2 days that followed, everything our combined and limited medical knowledge could offer, I drained what I could, packed the wound, forced what antibiotics Renata's group had scavenged into her system in doses that felt more like hope than treatment, but the fever had already progressed past what any of us had the tools to reverse. She died on the second morning, quietly, with Toby holding her hand and the dog lying pressed against her feet the entire time. An unbidden, unrequested vigil that none of us had the heart to interrupt. We buried her behind the dockmaster's office, in ground still soft enough from recent rain to dig without the ordeal it would have become a month earlier. And Denny said words over the grave that surprised me with their steadiness, given everything his voice had lost in the preceding weeks. She kept Toby calm when I couldn't, he said, simple, unadorned. She gave up her share of water twice that I know about, probably more that I don't. Whatever this world's become, she stayed a person in it right up until the end. And that's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. Toby didn't speak much in the days after, which none of us pushed him to explain. 19 years old, and he'd already watched more death than most people accumulate across a lifetime of ordinary bad luck. And the particular silence he carried afterward felt less like shock, and more like a boy quietly deciding what kind of man he intended to become on the other side of it. Denny's recovery came slower than his body's wounds required, which told me everything about the weight his mind was carrying that his physical injuries alone couldn't explain. He didn't talk about the month inside easily, not at first, offering fragments rather than a coherent account, the sound Marcus felt made when he first realized he could mimic voices he'd overheard. Badly, in a grotesque parody that had nearly gotten 2 people killed before they learned not to trust calls for help through the dark. The decision, made collectively and never fully forgiven by anyone who survived it, to stop searching for the 6 people who went missing one by one rather than risk more lives looking. The particular loneliness of feeding a dog through a gap in a wall every night for weeks. The only ritual he had left that felt like reaching toward the outside world instead of simply enduring it. I kept thinking you'd come, he told me one evening, sitting close enough by the fire that the dog had wedged itself between us, taking up more space than its size should have allowed. And I kept thinking, if you did come, I needed you to not open that door. Because I didn't know by the end. whether the thing that would come through the gap first was going to be Marcus or going to be me. What do you mean? I mean, by the third week, I understood exactly how he thought. I could predict his movements before he made them. I started wondering if that meant something was changing in me too. Whether being that close to something like him for that long does something to a person that doesn't show up as a bite mark. He looked at the dog rather than at me, scratching behind its torn ear with the specific tenderness of a man grateful for something to hold on to that didn't require words. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it was ever true, or if I was just so scared and so tired that my mind started inventing threats that weren't real yet, just to have something to prepare for. But I wrote that message on the door for both reasons. Don't open it because of him, and don't open it yet in case it was me. I didn't have an answer for that fear, not one that would have meant anything coming from someone who hadn't lived inside that building for a month. So I offered the only thing that felt honest. Instead, I stayed sitting beside him, saying nothing, until the fire burned low enough that the silence itself became its own kind of answer. We named the dog Vigil eventually. Though none of us discussed the decision formally, it simply became the name we used, one by one, until it had stuck without anyone remembering exactly whose idea it had been first. Petra was the one who spent the most time with him in the weeks that followed, a bond that had started as fascination and deepened through the shared trauma of that final breach into something closer to devotion. She'd been the one to insist we watch his behavior before making decisions, the one who trusted an animal's instincts over adults' tactical certainty. And I think some part of her recognized in Vigil's month-long refusal to abandon his post, a version of loyalty she'd been searching for in the human relationships that the outbreak had scattered or destroyed around her. Renata's group and our small collection of survivors from Coastal Freight didn't formally merge, not at first. But the lines between the two groups blurred quickly enough in the practical business of shared travel, shared watches, shared decisions about which direction offered the best chance at something resembling stability. Renata never apologized for the argument over breach order, and I never expected her to. We'd both been right about different things, and the specific alchemy of that near conflict had, in its own strange way, forged something sturdier between us than easy agreement would have. Silas stayed with the group longer than his initial involvement had suggested he intended to, and I came to understand, over the following weeks, that watching that dog's vigil for 26 days before I ever arrived had changed something in him too, a man who'd lost his own family in the outbreak's first chaotic days. Finding in an animal's stubborn loyalty a small private argument against the despair he'd been quietly carrying since. Denny healed, in the ways bodies heal and in the slower, more uneven ways that minds do. He didn't turn into Marcus felt, obviously, no matter how deeply that specific fear had lodged itself during his weeks of isolation, but he carried a wariness afterward that hadn't existed in him before. A habit of checking exits, counting people, calculating threat in rooms that held no threat at all. The particular residue that survival sometimes leaves behind long after the danger itself has passed. I think about the door often, still. Not the physical door. That specific building, that specific warehouse, is behind us now. One more waypoint in a landscape of waypoints we've learned not to grow too attached to. I think about the choice embedded in it. To open or not to open. To risk everything on the possibility that what waited on the other side was worth saving. Or to protect what remained by refusing to find out. Vigil made that choice every day for a month before any of us arrived to make it alongside him. Standing guard over a door that might have held nothing but horror, because the alternative, abandoning the possibility that someone he loved might still be worth waiting for, was a cost he simply refused to pay. I think, in the end, that's the whole of what any of us managed to salvage from that building. Not the supplies Renata originally came for, not even entirely. The brother I walked 7 miles through infected streets to find. What we salvaged was proof that loyalty could outlast even the worst month any of us had lived through. That it could hold a door closed against horror and hold a door open for hope in the very same gesture. And that sometimes the truest measure of what's worth saving isn't decided by the people doing the deciding at all. It's decided by whoever refuses to leave. I don't dream about Marcus Felt, though I expected I would. I dream, instead, about the sound of a chain rattling in darkness, and about a dog's silhouette against a dying street lamp, patient in a way I hadn't understood the first night I saw it, and understand completely now. We're 3 towns further north these days, in a stretch of country that hasn't yet learned to fear the particular dangers we survived. Denny walks point most mornings, Vigil at his heel, the two of them moving with a synchrony that took weeks of shared silence to build. Petra teaches Toby to read terrain the way Vigil once taught himself to read a warehouse's failing architecture patiently by watching what others miss. I still wear the bandana. DV, stitched crooked, faded past recognition to anyone who doesn't already know what it means. I touch it sometimes without deciding to. The way you touch a scar to confirm it healed the way you remember healing. What changed in me isn't easily named. Something about watching loyalty outlast reason, outlast hunger, outlast every rational argument for leaving. Something about understanding, finally, that the doors we're most afraid to open are usually the ones hiding exactly what we came looking for. Not safety, never safety, but the truth of what we're willing to risk everything to save. Vigil still sits by doors sometimes, out of habit, watching thresholds the rest of us have stopped noticing. We let him. Some vigils, I've learned, aren't meant to end. They're meant to be witnessed, carried forward, and finally, gratefully, shared.